welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you would like to become a patron of the podcast, just pop along to patreon.com/the History Network and find out about how to become a patron there. Thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 32, episode 8, The Battle of Issus. Alexander faces the Great King. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is, as you will all know, an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand, living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast, as well as writing for us regularly as well. At the Battle of Issus, fought in early November 333 BC, Alexander faced the Persian King Darius in person for the first time. Massively outnumbered, the Macedonian army faced the numberless might of the Persian military machine. The outcome would decide the future of both the Persian and the Macedonian empires. Alexander the Great had invaded the Persian Empire in spring 334 BC, crossing the Hellespont in fulfillment of the military ambitions of his father Philip II. Philip had been assassinated in 336 BC, and Alexander wasted no time in using the army his father had developed to ensure that Greece and Thrace were subdued before embarking on the most aggressive military campaign the world had ever seen. Within a month of his invasion of the Persian Empire, Alexander had faced and defeated a Persian army at the Battle of the Granicus in what is now northwestern Turkey. At the river Granicus he had faced an army commanded by Persian governors, satraps, and other nobles, and cobbled together out of their own troops. Victory opened the way for Alexander to march deeper into the Persian Empire, but he had yet to face the full force of the Persian army itself, or one commanded by the great King Darius III himself. Alexander marched along the west coast of modern-day Turkey, taking and besieging cities. In early 333 BC he marched into Galatia, Cappadocia, and Cilicia. There he received word that Darius was on the move to meet him. Darius had realized that he needed to face Alexander himself since the loss at Granicus. That defeat had meant not only had he lost several commanders, the losses in troops were immaterial, but cities and territories were now surrendering to Alexander without a fight. Some were welcoming him as a liberator. Darius therefore mustered his enormous army and marched to Sochi, the exact location of which is still debated, but it was somewhere in northwestern Syria. This gathering of his forces took some time, and it was much longer than a year before his army was gathered. Nonetheless, Darius stole a march on Alexander, who continued to advance southwards down the east coast of the Mediterranean, modern southeastern Turkey, before learning that Darius was, in fact, behind him. Having marched undetected from Sochi to Issus through the Amarnus Mountains, Alexander could not afford to have a Persian army behind him, cutting his line of supply and communication back to Greece. He turned about and marched northwards. We are told that Darius's army numbered up to 600,000 men, summoned from all across the empire, in addition to men from the Persian homelands and Media, contingents from Armenia Hyrcania, and other parts of the empire, as well as 30,000 Greek mercenaries. Most modern estimates reject this vast horde, bringing the total down to around 100,000 men. But whatever the actual number, Darius's army severely outnumbered Alexander's forces, a maximum of 40,000 men. One of the historians of Alexander, the Roman Quintus Curtius Rufus, gives the numbers of Persians at Issus as 250,000 infantry and 58,000 cavalry. Darius's first choice of position at Sochi gave him room for the deployment and manoeuvre of his entire force, but he was persuaded to advance to a narrower position at Issus and then the Panaris River. The plain here may still have been 4 kilometres wide, but it was not enough room to fit Darius's army, and he was forced to station a huge reserve of troops behind his front line. He must still have got the jump on Alexander, since his men had time to erect palisades and secure their position on the northern bank of the river. The mainstay of the Persian army was levies of troops armed with spear and bow. There were also a variety of contingents who were armed according to their own traditions, and fought with other weapons such as axes. The Persians had shields and some armour, although they were less well protected than their Macedonian opposition. As a result of this, Darius had a large number of Greek hoplite mercenaries, 30,000 of them according to Arrian. These were better armed and armoured than traditional Persian troops, and Darius even had Persian troops equipped and trained as hoplites, known as Cardaces. The backbone of the Macedonian army was the phalanx of 9,000 men recruited from the provinces of Macedonia. These men were divided into 6 divisions of 1,500 men each. Each man, known as a phalangite, was armed with a long spear, a sarissa, up to 6.5 meters long. We are given a range of lengths from 4 meters to 6.5. The phalangite also wore armour, a shield, and carried a sword. In addition to this, Alexander had a corps of heavy cavalry, the companions, armed with a spear of their own, the xyston. The men of the phalanx were also known as the foot companions. Alexander led the cavalry in person on decisive charges, something of a change from Greek and Macedonian generals before him who led the infantry. There was also a unit of 3,000 hypaspists, or foot guards, which protected the flanks of the phalanx. To augment these, Alexander's army had a variety of other troops, light armed peltasts and archers, and various mercenaries and other types of cavalry. Despite the excellent training of such contingents, they were, nevertheless, massively outnumbered. At Issus, Alexander would march northward straight into battle. We are told that he entered the plain approaching Darius's position at a very narrow part, where he had to deploy his phalanx in double depth, 32 men deep rather than the usual 16, and with his cavalry drawn up behind that double depth phalanx. As he advanced towards Darius, he was able to extend his line, making the phalanx its normal depth and placing his cavalry on each wing. On the right he had his Thessalian and Macedonian cavalry, next to them his royal guard cavalry and hypaspists. Then came the phalanx in 6 divisions. Next to them on the left wing were the Peloponnesian cavalry. Behind these he drew up a line consisting of his mercenaries, probably to fill any gaps created in his line and to replace any losses. In front of his whole formation he placed a screen of skirmishers and archers. These advanced towards the Persians. There is some confusion in our sources, not only to the number of men involved, but also how they were deployed. It is most likely, however, that Darius himself was on the left of the Persian line with his cavalry and the infantry from Persia and Media. Arrian, usually our most reliable source, places him in the centre of the Persian line, but there are sound reasons to reject this. This would place him behind the Greek mercenaries, which is highly unlikely. Next to these were more Persian infantry, possibly the Cardaces, armed in the manner of Greek hoplites. Then came the Greek mercenary hoplites, followed by the Persian right wing of cavalry with a contingent of archers and slingers. In front of the Persian line was a screen of javelin men and slingers. Darius also deployed a force, possibly of Cardaces, on a hill on the southern bank of the river which would threaten the Macedonian right flank. As Alexander continued to advance, he sent his screening force of light armed troops to dislodge the force threatening his right flank. This was achieved without too much fuss, even though Arrian tells us that the flanking force consisted of 20,000 men. Darius reinforced his own right wing with a cavalry contingent from his left, probably the Median cavalry. Seeing this, Alexander strengthened his own left wing by sending the Thessalians from the Macedonian right wing to reinforce his commander there, Parmenion. The exact sequence of events after this becomes slightly unclear, and our sources disagree. It is possible that things happened simultaneously, although there is reason to accept the following reconstruction. The reinforced right wing of the Persian cavalry charged across the Panaris River, engaging the cavalry of the Macedonian left wing commanded by Parmenion. The remainder of the Persian army did not move from their prepared positions, but as soon as the Macedonian army came within range, they unleashed a hail of different missiles upon them. Perhaps at the same time as the charge into the Macedonian left, Alexander launched a charge of his own on the right, crossing the river. Here we are let down by our sources. Arrian tells us that Alexander charged straight at Darius, who he has positioned in the middle of his army behind the Greek mercenaries. This won't work, since it is unlikely that Darius would position himself behind Greek mercenaries and not his own elite troops and royal guard, the apple bearers. It also makes Alexander's charge difficult to understand, straight into heavy hoplite infantry in the middle of the battlefield. Curtius's positioning of Darius on the left wing of the Persian formation solves most issues, however. Alexander seems to have charged straight at Darius, having the Persian king on the left makes this more explicable, especially if moving cavalry to the Persian right wing created a gap or a disruption in the Persian formation close to Darius's position. Taking his companion cavalry, the royal guard, the Hippospists, and the rightmost divisions of the phalanx, Alexander charged into the river. This combined force of infantry and cavalry dislodged the troops opposing them from the northern bank of the river. In order not to lose contact with the rightmost divisions of the phalanx, however, the other divisions of the phalanx will have been forced to advance obliquely into the river. There they engaged with the Persian infantry and the Greek mercenaries opposite them. The mercenaries were regarded by Arrian as Darius's best troops and the equal of the phalanx. According to his numbers, they outnumbered the phalanx by 3-1. This is the reason Arrian wants Darius in the middle of his line, behind what Arrian considered his best troops. Arrian also wants Alexander to defeat the mercenaries with his initial cavalry charge. Alexander did defeat the Greek mercenaries, but in a different manner. The cavalry fight on the Macedonian left was hard fought, and the phalanx versus mercenary infantry battle in the river was a stalemate. The battle would be decided on the Macedonian right, where Alexander's charge pushed the enemy from the river bank. We do not know how hard the fighting there was, but at some point Darius fled from the battle in his chariot. Arrian has this occur almost as soon as Alexander charged. When Darius fled, his troops, especially his elite apple-bearers, went with him. Alexander then turned his attention to charge the rear and flank of the Greek mercenaries who were pressuring his phalanx in the river. If Alexander's initial charge had been through the mercenaries, this would have been impossible. Attacked on two sides, the mercenaries too fled. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion finally got the upper hand and sent the Persian cavalry from the field. The Persian reserve had not fought at all, but they also took to their heels. All these events may have happened close together, and possibly as soon as Darius broke and fled. For this reason it seems likely that Darius put up a fight for some time, something some of our Greek sources do not want to credit him with. A general rout of the Persian army followed Darius's flight. We are told Darius fled until nightfall or midnight, first in his chariot and then on horseback. He was pursued by Alexander, but had too much of a head start. He had lost 110,000 casualties, as well as his camp. There Darius's wife, mother, and 3 of his children had awaited the outcome of the battle, but so thorough was his defeat that there was no time to evacuate them. Alexander took all of them captive. The Persian war chest had been sent to Damascus, but it too would fall into Alexander's hands. It is a testament to the vast resources of the Persian Empire that Darius was able to recoup his losses and build an even bigger army, 1 million men according to some sources, to face Alexander again at Gaugamela in 331 BC. On the Macedonian side we are told of remarkably low, suspiciously so, casualty numbers. One source has only 504 wounded, 32 infantry deaths and 150 cavalry deaths. Another adjusts this up to 130 infantry deaths. We may be sceptical, and editors will be found adding zeros to make the numbers of Macedonian losses higher, but the losses in all of Alexander's battles are disproportionately low. The Persians were less well armoured than the Macedonians, which may explain this discrepancy in part, as might the fact that many of the casualties occurred when the Persians broke and fled. Arrian tells us of a ravine filled with corpses during the pursuit. Rather than provide the showdown between Darius and Alexander, Darius's escape at Issus allowed him to live to fight another day. For Alexander, however, it reinforced the superiority of his troops and of his leadership over Darius and the Persians. Darius's defeat also sent a clear message to the Persian Empire that they needed to take Alexander seriously. Several cities, whole provinces in some cases, now welcomed Alexander with open arms as a liberator. Others, like the city of Tyre, put up a stout resistance. Alexander followed Issus not by pursuing Darius to Babylon, but by continuing down the coast of the Levant and on into Egypt. Having secured the empire behind him, he returned to advance on Babylon and faced Darius again in 331 BC, at the beginning of Gaugamela, where the fate of the Persian Empire would be decided once and for all. Thanks very much, Murray, for writing another script for us. If you would like to write a script for us, drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org, and let us know your idea. Again, if you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, just go to patreon.com/thehistorynetwork and sign up there. Thanks again to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.